Hey everybody, welcome to your Chapter 2 lecture, which is Developmental Risk and Protective Factors for Criminal Behavior. I hope you had an opportunity to read through the chapter. I am not covering everything that's in the chapters in these lectures, so please do take time to also be reading the entire chapter and highlighting important information in your reading. Okay, so as we're talking about the idea of where criminal behavior stems from, this week we're going to really be talking about this idea of developmental risk factors and developmental protective factors. So the developmental perspective is really the idea that through the life course that all humans are following a path or trajectory, and that depending on certain circumstances in a person's life, this path or trajectory may be littered with certain risk factors and also protective factors. When we're thinking about protective factors, that can be defined as personal characteristics or experiences that can shield children and adolescents from serious antisocial behavior. Things, when you think about these characteristics, these protective factors, thinking about stable homes, compassionate caregivers, attachment to family, good educational experiences, and really kind of just a general nurturing and healthy environment that minimizes biologically and socially toxic conditions that can influence that healthy development. And then when we're talking about risk factors, we're talking about the opposite of those protective factors, right? So risk factors being characteristics or experiences that can place children at risk of antisocial or criminal activity. So we sort of touched on this, I think, in Chapter 1 when we were talking about how children learn what is acceptable and not acceptable as far as criminal behavior goes from their environment. So now we're going to go a little bit more in depth and take a look at some more specific risk factors. We're going to look at these three different types of risk factors. The first is a family risk factors, and this includes faulty or inadequate parenting, bad influence from siblings, effects of poverty, and child maltreatment or abuse. Psychological risk factors are inadequate cognitive and language ability, which we're going to talk more about, lack of empathy, poor interpersonal and social skills, and behavioral disorders. And social environmental factors are inadequate schools, toxic environments, natural disasters. And we're talking about toxic environments. We're not really talking about like emotionally toxic environments, although, that does fall more into kind of that family dynamic. But we're talking about actual toxicity in the environment. And again, we're going to kind of go into more of what that can look like later on in this chapter. When we're looking at these risk factors throughout our chapter this week, we're going to need to pay special attention to how this can really impact a person's developmental pathway, especially during the earliest stages of development. It's also really important, a caveat to remember as we're discussing this chapter, that you can't tie all criminal behavior directly to childhood. So it's also important to remember that some people begin their criminal offending in adulthood, and so it's not really as cut and dry as we can always tie it to these sort of adverse childhood experiences or risk factors. The cumulative risk model, when we're talking about developmental risk and protective factors, discusses how exposure to multiple risk factors is most likely to increase the probability that a child, adolescent, or adult develops antisocial behavior and other maladaptive behaviors. The cumulative risk model is really talking about the idea of a snowball effect of these risk factors. So exposure to multiple risk factors is going to increase the probability, right? So it's not just one risk factor that somebody is up against, but it's the cumulative price of all of the risk factors adding up. So an example would be that living in poverty is a recognized risk factor, but it's not enough to cause antisocial behavior. Most poor children are in fact not antisocial. However, when you think about other things that can come along with living in poverty, like substandard housing, lack of good education opportunities, exposure to chemical toxins, maybe a higher incidence of crime or parental substance use, then we're talking about how all of those things are building up for somebody and how that accumulation of risk factors is increasing the probability that they are not going to be able to stay the course and not fall into that antisocial criminal behavior. This model is really favored by some developmental researchers who believe that this accumulation of risk factors in the absence of sufficient protective factors result in negative behavioral, emotional, and cognitive outcomes. And I think that it seems pretty straightforward when we think about it, that a person can only go through so many of these difficult situations and risk factors before it becomes too much and overwhelms them. It's also a very simple model because you just are simply counting the number of risk factors, and so it's very easily understood by people and also communicated by researchers. If you look in your book on page 33, there's a table there, table 2.1, and it has risk factors broken down into these different categories, and so you can take a look at that and think about if you were to look at the accumulation of these certain risks and how that would impact somebody's development. Another similar but slightly more complicated model is the developmental cascade model. And this was first introduced by several developmental psychologists. And it's distinct from the cumulative model because it really underscores the importance of the interaction among risk factors and their effect on outcomes over the course of development. So this developmental cascade refers to the idea that function in one area or level of a system can spread to another level or domain as a result of the interplay across the levels and functional domains. So, for example, if you're thinking about a child who has a difficulty with communication, and that difficulty in communication then leads directly into being rejected by their peers, which leads to more, that rejection then cascades into more aggressive and frustrated behavior. And then that leads into more violent outbursts, right? So it's not necessarily the same thing as adding up all of the different risk factors, but instead it's looking at how they really play into one another and how they sort of fall in line and then interact with one another over that developmental lifespan. According to this model, the person's developmental skills or deficits enhance, affect, or determine the next skill or deficit. So that's how it differs from the cumulative model. There's also more of a focus in the developmental cascade model on protective factors. So while it's recognized that there may be an accumulation of risk factors, there's also an accumulation or combination of protective factors. So for example, in that scenario that I gave, there could also be on the other side of that, in the same how that played out, if you have really effective parenting and you have very involved parents and an adequate, safe school environment, that could really alter how those risk factors are coming into play for that person. And then that can really sway the outcome of their developmental journey or trajectory. So here is a really nice comparison of the key aspects of cumulative risk and developmental cascade models. And you can see that they are very similar. Just the developmental cascade model is, again, kind of a little bit more distinct and looking at how one thing leads into the next thing as opposed to just looking at each thing independently. Resilience, what an important term when we're thinking about the developmental trajectory and developmental risk and protective factors. So resilience is an individual protective factor that resists the influence of multiple risk factors. So resilience has really emerged when many mental health professionals and researchers notice that there are always children who develop well despite experiencing traumatic, disadvantaged, or abusive childhoods. I would say that probably we've all encountered these folks in life where it seems like objectively, when you zoom out and look at what they've gone through in life and what they've been through, that they, by all means should have ended up in a much worse situation that they're in, but they haven't. They've been able to rise up and overcome. I think when we think about a lot of really inspirational people who have gone through great tragedy and adversity, these people have demonstrated an amazing amount of resilience. It's generally defined as successful coping with or overcoming risk and adversity, the development of competence in the face of severe stress and hardship, and success in developmental tasks or meeting societal expectations. So really, it's the ability to bounce back quickly and adaptively from negative emotional experiences. When we're talking about resilience, 3 conditions must be met. So first, the individual must have been exposed to or have experienced significant threats or severe adversity, ranging from a single event such as the death of a parent or sibling to an accumulation of ongoing negative experiences, such as physical, mental, and/or sexual abuse. Second, the child must demonstrate the achievement of positive adaptation despite the major assaults on the developmental process. Adaptation can include the achievement of developmental milestones, the absence of psychological distress, an indicator of better than average well-being or thriving. The third condition involves the factors that enable the child to avoid or recover from adverse or traumatic experiences. These are the protective factors mentioned above. Essentially, protective factors insulate or shield the individual from the adverse and damaging effects of risk factors and encourage the development of resilience in those individuals who experience significant adversity. So it's also important to remember that resilience doesn't mean that these people are not going through the risk, but they're just, for some reason, have this resilience in their ability to deal with it. I think, again, when you think about 2 people can go through the exact same traumatic experience and it can be highly traumatic, and one of those people will come out of that experience with significant lasting effects of post-traumatic stress disorder, and one of them won't. And that's because, for whatever reason, which, I think is a little bit unclear, we don't have a black and white answer for why some people experience that resilience and others don't. But some people will come out of those experiences without any lasting impacts of the trauma. So resilience is a really incredible thing and an important thing when we're talking about all of these risk factors. Okay, so now we're going to talk about family risk and protective factors. So it's important to take into account that really the family has long been identified in criminology literature as a crucial factor in a child or adolescent's prosocial and antisocial behavior. And one of the things that's important to remember, and that we'll talk a little bit more about, but researchers have really been looking more at the process variables, which would be like the quality of parenting, over the structural variables. So I think it can often be conveyed that the healthiest way to raise a child is with a mother and a father in the home. And really, what we've come to understand is it's really not quite that simple, because the quality of parenting can be higher in a single parent home than in a dysfunctional home with both parents, is an example. So one of the things that we're gonna cover in this section is talking about poverty. And while poverty does have adverse effects on child development and is a risk factor, it's really also important to remember that there is no direct correlation between being poor and being criminal, okay? That is not how it goes. And also, keeping in mind that many juvenile offenders and adult criminals, even those who are very violent, are often very far from economically deprived. So though a lot of people do not fall into the category of being poor. So just want to put that out there. I want to make sure that there's no muddy water about that to be poor is to be criminal, because that is just it's not true. So poverty refers to a situation in which the basic resources to maintain an average standard of living within a specific geographic region are lacking. So this typically includes the absence of sufficient income to meet basic necessities of life. Approximately 20% of children in the United States live in families that have incomes that fall below the federal poverty line. Among all children under 18 in the United States, 41% are low income, and another 19% are poor. Black, Hispanic, and Native American children are disproportionately high in these categories. So the research is substantial in underscoring the adverse effects of poverty on child development. And again, it's sort of going back to that idea of the certain environmental and social risk factors that are entwined in poverty. So these poverty cofactors, right? So poverty cofactors can fit both into the cumulative risk and developmental cascade models. Poverty is also, often accompanied by discrimination, racism, family disruption, unsafe living conditions, poor nutrition, joblessness, social isolation, and limited social support. Youth who are living in poverty are more likely to attend inadequate schools, to drop out of school, to be unemployed, to be victimized, and to be a witness to a variety of violent offense. They live in social environments with low quality health care, greater exposure to pesticides, higher noise levels, fewer open spaces, and greater exposure to lead and other neurotoxins. An important thing to note as we're reading through this chapter and discussing poverty as a risk factor is that individuals living in poverty are more likely to be victims, not offenders of crime. And again, this goes back to, not having a lot of protection, not living in safe neighborhoods, not having the resources to keep themselves safe. So I think that's an important thing to differentiate here. Also, again, just want to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about how poverty can really impact parents' abilities to provide a safe, stable, supportive family environment. When you think about somebody who's working 3 jobs to try to feed their family, and how stressful that is, and how exhausted they are and overwhelmed, and living in that sort of stress reactivity space, that makes it really difficult to not fall into some parenting models that are less than ideal. For example, like the sort of easy fix, band-aid parenting models, and not having the time and patience to really work through behavioral challenges with children. So again, like looking at that kind of cascade of the parental stress from the poverty being tied into perhaps some more aggressive forms of discipline in the home, which, as we all know, when children are, when physical punishment is used, that perpetuates later on in life for the child, that they learn that that is how you solve problems, and then also carries on through cycles in families. Single parent households. Over 12 million American families with children are maintained by only one parent. 28% of all children in the United States lived with one parent, and 88% of these children were with their mothers. So when we're talking about single parent households, as already mentioned, looking at the quality of the relationship and not just the structural facts of the home, that there aren't two parents there. The really important things when we're talking about protective factors in single parent homes: the quality of the relationship between the child and the non-custodial parent if the parent remains in the child's life, the family's economic status, and the degree of emotional support provided to the family by other adults, such as extended family members or community surrogates. So talking about, again, the home and how children are treated in the home, we're going to talk a little bit about parental styles and practices. Parental practices and parental behavioral patterns. So parental practices are strategies employed by parents to achieve specific academic, social, or athletic goals across different contexts and situations. So when parents are using parenting practices, their focus is on affecting some particular aspect of the child. Reading with children, attending their sports events, or serving as room parents in school are examples of parenting practices. Now, when we're talking about parenting styles, this refers to the parent-child interactions characterized by parental attitudes toward the child and the emotional climate of the parent-child relationship. The first one that we're going to discuss is an authoritarian style of parenting, and this is really founded in trying to shape, control, and evaluate the behavior of their children in accordance with some pre-established absolute standard. So the authoritarian household has numerous rules and regulations that are rigidly followed. Not a lot of dialogue going on in this style of parenting about the child's feelings, or letting the child have a voice or a say in anything. Authoritarian parents really expect their children to just be obedient and unquestioningly respectful of authority. So a lot of punitive, forceful sort of measures when children step out of line. Then we have a permissive style, which is probably the direct opposite of that authoritarian style. So they display tolerant, non-punitive, accepting attitudes toward their children's behavior, including when the child has expressions of aggressive and sexual impulses. So they just avoid asserting any authority or imposing social controls or restrictions on the child behavior. So, the kids are kind of setting the rules for eating, sleeping, how much they watch TV, all that kind of thing. And there's very little parental monitoring going on. Okay, then we have the authoritative style, different than authoritarian. And these parents are trying to direct their children's activities in a rational, issue-oriented manner. There's a lot of decision-making exchanges and a general spirit of open communication between parents and children. So really, when you think about this, it's a discussion between parent and child, but also punctuated with social controls from the parents. And then the final neglecting style is when parents are demonstrating detachment and very little involvement in their children's life or activities. They are neither demanding nor responsive. So this is different than that permissive style, because in the permissive style, the parents are caring. They're just deciding that they're going to let their children sort of figure it out on their own and be this kind of, resource if they're needed. Neglecting style is really detached, and, in the extreme form, this is what qualifies as child neglect. It's not really surprising that neglecting parenting was one of the strongest risk factors identified with delinquency and a life of crime. So incredibly damaging to children to be living with a neglecting parent. Probably obvious in the description of these parenting styles, but the one that is consistently shown to be the most effective with the highest outcomes of success is the authoritative parenting style, having that communication and also that level of direction and monitoring that children need. Children like structure. It makes them feel safe. So again, the authoritative parent is providing that structure while also allowing the child to have some conversations around it. Parental monitoring refers to parents' awareness of their child's peers, associates, what they're doing in their free time, and their physical whereabouts when they're outside the home. So, poor parental monitoring is a strong risk factor for delinquency, especially as children are sort of reaching those adolescent years and they're starting to venture out more and more with peers and more away from their parents. If parents aren't keeping track of where their children are and what they're up to, obviously, young adolescents are not making the best decisions. So that's a strong risk factor for them to veer off and be making some very poor decisions. One of the things that has been identified to be the most helpful when this adolescent phase takes off and these teenagers are starting to veer away more and more and more from their family home and more towards their peers. One of the strongest protective factors is positive parent-youth relationships. So going back to those styles of parenting, when you think about the one that's probably eliciting the most conversation and connection between parents and children, it's the authoritative model. So thinking about, even with really young children, trying to set up a place where they feel very safe in coming and talking to parents about what's happening for them, what their struggles are, if they're struggling with peers. That sets the stage for this later time in life when adolescents are starting to, again, kind of like make their own decisions, want to be more with their friends, all that kind of thing. If they feel safe in coming and talking to their parents, that's found to be an extremely positive protective factor for them to stay away from criminal behavior and substance use. So parental psychopathology, I'm sure we can all imagine, can have a negative impact on a child's development and is a risk factor. So these can include depression, alcoholism, domestic violence, child abuse, and neglect. Okay, so talking about the importance of attachment. Attachment theory and attachment disorder is becoming so incredibly important in so many things that we're studying psychologically. And really, attachment theory is that the early relationship between an infant and a caregiver really largely determines the quality of social relationships later in life. So when we're talking about attachment theory, we're going to talk about these four different types of attachment theory. The first is secure attachment, and this secure attachment happens when an infant and baby experience warm, loving connection with their caregiver. So what's happening when a caregiver picks up an infant who is crying? Because the infant does not at that time have the brain capacity to self soothe, what happens is the caregiver picks the baby up, and the baby stops crying because there's a neurochemical called oxytocin that is released into the baby's brain, and that's what soothes them. It makes them feel happy and calmer. And that really sets the stage for this secure attachment. So because they have that experience of going through something a little bit scary, crying, right, not knowing where they are, and then being held by their caregiver and being soothed and feeling better, they learn that the world is a safe place. So this sets them up to be able to explore new areas with confidence, not be overly anxious when their caregiver leaves, and also directly ties into their ability to form lasting, meaningful, secure connections in adulthood. The child does become distressed when the parent leaves, but can also continue to play and have fun, and then is happy to see the parent as soon as they're back. Insecure attachments is usually divided into two attachment styles: anxious and ambivalent, and avoidant. Anxious, ambivalent attached child is intensely distressed and anxious by separation in new environments. They cling anxiously to their parents and don't really feel comfortable exploring. And when the parent returns after separation, the child may be indifferent or even hostile, and they may push that returning parent away, stiffen up, or cry. So really insecure, anxious attachment. Avoidant attachment is characterized by not much distress on the part of the infant, whether the parent is present or not. And they rarely cry during separation or reunification. And this kind of attachment in infancy is associated with dismissing attachment in adulthood, so not being able to form those attachments in adulthood. In the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which is what we use in mental health to diagnose mental health disorders, there are diagnoses of reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder, both of which are precipitated by the absence of adequate caregiving during infancy or early childhood. This is a reactive attachment disorder, of course, when in its most extreme example is when you think of children who are in like Russian orphanages and are just left to cry and not comforted. It actually changes the way that their brain develops and makes it so that they have a very difficult time creating any kind of stable attachment throughout their entire lives. And of course, when you're thinking about how this plays into later behavior, it has a really big impact on criminal behavior and lack of empathy and lack of connection. There's also a hypothesis that many sex offenders probably had parents who were inconsistently affectionate and poor at identifying their child's needs. So they demonstrate that dismissing, avoidant attachment style in their adult relationships. Also, when we're thinking about victims of interpersonal violence, that sort of anxious attachment can come into play when the violent person feels that their partner is leaving them and they become incredibly dangerous and physically violent. That can be tied back to that extreme anxiety about that that losing of that attachment. Okay, so also really important to take into account association with peers. So peer influence is a really strong predictor of adolescent substance use and delinquent behavior, probably no surprise there. And there's an increased susceptibility to peer influence during adolescence, as I was talking about. And if you have taken human growth and development, that's a normal part of that developmental phase. So we want our adolescents to be going out and exploring those peer connections, because that is how they are setting themselves up to move into the world from the family home. So being less attached to home and more attached to their peers, forming those really intense connections. Of course, what we hope is that they make good decisions and that they are attaching to peers who are on a trajectory of positivity in their lives, and that if they get pulled in another direction, it can be difficult to reverse that. So, of course, I think we can also all relate to being in those teenage years, especially early teenage years, and really doing anything for that acceptance, right? And that can include risky, delinquent, dangerous, criminal behavior. Interestingly enough, one of the strongest predictors of later involvement in antisocial behavior is early rejection. So not the peer rejection in adolescence, but looking earlier than that in elementary school. Being liked and accepted by the peer group is crucial in the child's development. So as we're taking a look at that, social rejection in elementary school grades is a powerful risk factor for delinquency in adolescents. Peer rejection by first grade peers is significantly linked to the development of antisocial behavior as soon as the fourth grade. Children who were rejected for at least 2 to 3 years by second grade had a 50% chance of displaying clinically significant antisocial behavior later in adolescence, in contrast with just 9% chance for those children who managed to avoid early peer rejection. So when we're thinking about what causes that rejection by peers, often children are rejected for being perceived as being different. So children who are diagnosed with Asperger's or other disorders on the autism spectrum are rejected and ostracized because they have a difficult time with that social interaction. Also, children who are overly aggressive tend to be rejected by their peers. And children who are both physically aggressive and socially rejected have a higher probability of becoming serious delinquents during adolescence and violent offenders during early adulthood. Not all children who are aggressive are rejected. For some reason, there are some children who can be aggressive who actually children like seek those kids out to be their friends. So that can be a little bit different. It's not black and white. Also, when we're thinking about kind of the differences in peer rejection, we think about boys kind of being more sort of physically aggressive, and we think about girls being more relationally aggressive. And that relational aggressive is like that gossiping, talking behind their back, that sort of thing. And then kind of going back to this cascade idea, right, of how these things are all coming together. As children are being rejected by their peers, they have less opportunity to learn social and interpersonal skills, which then alienates them in adulthood and adolescence, and it sort of sets the stage, right, for that, for who we think about when we think of people who are very antisocial. So psychological and behavioral risk and protective factors. Preschool experiences, very important. Poor quality childcare, can put the child's development at risk for poor language development, cognitive development, and also lower ratings of social and emotional adjustment. Academic failure can have a cascading effect, so much so that early academic failure seems to be strongly associated with delinquency and adult criminal behavior. So academic failure, I think, also kind of plays into that alienation when we think about kids who are held back in school and how that can create that embarrassment or shame, or then other kids, right, start to alienate them because they are not moving along at the same rate. And then we're going to talk about lack of empathy. So empathy is, there are two different types of empathy. Empathy is being able to understand what somebody else is going through, and there are two dimensions of it, affective and cognitive. So affective empathy is an emotional response characterized by feelings of concern for another and a desire to alleviate that person's distress. Cognitive empathy refers to the ability to understand a person from his or her frame of reference or point of view rather than simply from one's own point of view. So cognitive empathy is being able to understand it. I'm sorry, I forgot. Oh no, I'm still on the same slide. Okay. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand it. Affective empathy is more emotional, right? Cognitive is I understand where that person is coming from. Affective is more I feel where that person is coming from and I want to help them. There's also this concept called theory of mind, and this refers to a capacity to recognize the thoughts of feelings of other people. Maybe you've heard about, being able to read people. This is not as relevant in the study of criminal behavior as empathy, because studies haven't really focused much on associating it with antisocial personality, or gosh, I keep saying that, antisocial behavior. Deficiencies in empathy, of course, have long been considered characteristic of persistently aggressive and antisocial individuals, especially low affective empathy, which is hypothesized to be a central ingredient of psychopathy, which is a combination of psychological, neuropsychological, and behavioral factors related to an increased tendency to engage in antisocial and violent behavior. So when we're thinking about psychopaths, we're thinking about people who are kind of on the furthest end of the spectrum, right? Lack of empathy, and especially, again, that affective empathy. So even if they're able to understand the thoughts and feelings cognitively of somebody else, they do not seem to have the ability to really put themselves there emotionally, which can be a recipe for continuing to engage in violent behavior. Girls generally show both dimensions of empathy earlier in life than boys, and one of the things that I'm sure we've all heard about when we're, thinking about criminal behavior, especially related to, serial killers and that kind of thing, the relationship between animal cruelty and the indication for violent behavior late in life. So we're not really talking about just normal childhood learning how to treat animals here, right? We're talking about a different level of torturing and abusing animals. And there have been several studies that have found a strong association between animal cruelty and violent behavior towards humans. I'm almost done, baby. Here, can you not, I don't have anything for you to color on.
Okay. Okay. This?
Yeah, you can color in that, okay? Okay, but you have to be really quiet for Mama, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Mama.
Okay, so one thing to think about that's actually tends to really increase the risk of behavioral problems is language deficiencies and language impairment. So, language impairment refers to problems expressing or understanding language, and oftentimes poor language development can be traced back to maltreatment or neglect. Of course, not always, but sometimes or often. And in a study of Swedish children, researchers discovered that poor language development during the second year of life was a significant predictor of adult criminal behavior. And also, researchers found that boys diagnosed with a language impairment at age 5 were far more likely to exhibit delinquent behavior at age 19 than a group of boys without early indications of a language impairment. So, language impairment appears to produce a serious cascading effect on healthy academic and social development. It makes school painful and unappealing, and also, again, can lead to that detachment from peers and social rejection. Also, intelligence and delinquency. There's an inverse relationship between IQ scores and delinquency. So the lower the IQ score, the higher level of delinquency there seems to be. And again, I think that this could be because of that, social alienation. Also, when you think about how children are treated in school, and if they struggle more, oftentimes they're sort of identified as a problem or not encouraged and supported as much. So all of these things really come into play as, again, risk factors that can lead to that criminal behavior. None of this is, definite. If you have this, then you end up here. So even with the animal cruelty, although there are lots of studies that show that that's an indication of potential violent behavior later in life, it's also not a direct correlation. Also, when we're talking about risk factors in childhood, we talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and there are 3 central behaviors that define this disorder: inattention, impulsivity, and excessive motor activity. Excessive motor activity meaning difficulty in holding still, and this can make it really difficult. So, inattention, cannot listen or is easily distracted. Impulsivity, acting before thinking, shifts quickly from one activity to another. So think about kind of losing focus, not being able to stay focused. And then that excessive motor activity, can't sit still, fidgets, can't stop running around, talkative and noisy. This is the leading psychological diagnosis for American children. And symptoms often emerge in preschool. Again, when we're thinking about the cascading effect of ADHD, it can cause a lot of difficulty in school, in ability to connect with peers, and can really inhibit that positive developmental experience. It does seem that there is a genetic component involved with ADHD, and it really is a disorder of self-control and emotional regulation. There are indications that children with untreated ADHD can go on to not only engage in antisocial behavior, but also abuse drugs and alcohol. So, again, there is not a definite idea of where ADHD comes from or how it happens, but there are some researchers who estimate that about 1/4 of all children with ADHD engage in serious antisocial behavior during childhood and adolescence, and criminal behavior as adults. So a very large number of ADHD children self-report delinquent behaviors by early adolescence. And also that children between the ages of 5 and 7 who display the characteristics of both ADHD and delinquent behavior not only have special difficulty with social relationships, but also have a high probability of consistent, serious antisocial behavior into adolescence and beyond. It's also very prevalent, the ADHD rates in detention centers and prison. Very high rates of that disorder are found there amongst the inmates. So conduct disorder often occurs with ADHD, and this is a cluster of behaviors characterized by persistent misbehavior. And so when we're talking about conduct disorders, there's childhood onset and adolescent onset. And these examples of conduct disorders, behavior would be stealing, fire setting, running away from home, skipping school, destroying property, fighting, frequently telling lies, and cruelty to animals and people. The central feature of conduct disorder is a repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior that violates the basic rights of others or violates major age-appropriate societal norms. So there can be mild forms, such as minimal harm to persons or property, to severe forms, such as substantial harm. If this begins prior to age 10, it's called conduct disorder child onset type. And then if it is after that, it's the adolescent onset type. Oppositional defiant disorder is another one that, together with conduct disorder, are often classified as disruptive behavioral disorders. And they involve both behaviors and emotions. According, again, to the DSM, oppositional defiance disorder represents problems in self-control of emotions and behavior, while conduct disorder represents just more problems in control of behavior. The DSM describes that oppositional defiant disorder is the child who has this is negative, hostile, vindictive, and defiant, more than expected for his or her age. So we're not just talking about the 3-year-old who's testing boundaries, or the adolescent who's kind of starting to test the waters, right? Sort of more than that. It has to be bigger than that, and it has to be causing significant damage to, to progression of normal development. So, although some research does suggest that early signs of oppositional defiant disorder predict early onset of conduct disorder, it's largely unknown if oppositional defiant disorder predicts criminal behavior over the long run. And some, recent research shows that it does not necessarily lead to long-term antisocial or serious criminal behavior. So, again, this is kind of a complex relationship, right, among these certain disorders and how they come to be and how they affect that developmental trajectory. So here's a good quote to think about it and kind of wrap your mind around it. Delinquent adult boys usually traverse a developmental pathway that begins with severe hyperactivity or impulse behaviors as early as toddlerhood, followed by oppositional defiant disorder in preschool, early onset conduct disorder in elementary school, then goes on to substance use disorders in adolescence, and then antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. So again, I think that is maybe a good way to conceptualize that idea of the cascade of things, right? That it starts here, and especially without positive supportive intervention, can really lead into bigger and more difficult to shift out of behaviors, right? So yeah, so that's our lecture for today, and that's chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed learning some more about how those early childhood developmental factors can play into later criminal behavior, and I look forward to reading your discussion posts about this chapter. All right, have a great week, and I will talk to you again next week.